My husband walked into the courtroom smiling like a man arriving at his own victory party, his arm wrapped around a visibly pregnant woman. I didn't look away. Because inside my lawyer's briefcase was a sealed envelope that was about to erase that smile forever. Divorce court is quieter than people imagine. No dramatic shouting, no gasps. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffling of papers, and the thick, suffocating tension of lives being dismantled by procedure. I remember every detail of that morning. The courthouse sat between a federal building and a coffee shop that smelled of burnt espresso. People walked in and out carrying folders like they were late for meetings, not legal endings. I stood near the entrance, hands cold, despite the mild California winter, watching strangers live ordinary Tuesdays. My lawyer, Ms. Harper, arrived exactly on time. She wore charcoal gray as always, no-nonsense heels, hair pulled back, calm, clinical eyes. "You okay, Claire?" she asked. "Yes." It wasn't bravery, it was exhaustion. She studied my face for half a second longer than necessary, then nodded. "Stay steady. Let them perform." Perform? That word would echo later. We entered Department 42. Wood benches. Neutral walls. The American flag tucked into a corner like a silent witness. A bailiff leaned against the side, bored but alert. I sat at the petitioner's table and waited. Mark was late. Of course he was. Mark had been late to apologies, late to accountability, late to truth, but never late to anything that benefited him. 10 minutes passed. Then the door opened. He didn't just walk in, he made an entrance. Mark stepped into the courtroom wearing that tailored navy suit he'd bought during what he'd called his business expansion phase, the phase that turned out to be an affair-funded fantasy. But it wasn't the suit. It was the woman attached to him. Blonde, younger, confident in the careless way youth often is. Her dress stretched gently over a round stomach. His hand rested there possessively, fingers splayed like a declaration. Pregnant. They paused just inside the doorway, letting everyone see. Mark's smile was radiant, triumphant, cruel. I felt Ms. Harper's leg shift slightly beside me. "Don't react," she murmured. I hadn't planned to. But humiliation is a strange thing. It doesn't stab. It burns slowly, spreading heat under your skin while your dignity fights not to collapse. Mark's eyes found mine and lingered. There was satisfaction there, thick, unmistakable satisfaction. As if this was the final proof that he had won. He guided the woman Tessa to the respondent's table like a gentleman escorting a date to dinner. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The message was already delivered. Judge Reynolds entered moments later. Silver hair, reading glasses, the composed authority of someone who had seen every possible version of marital failure. "Good morning," he said. We rose, sat. Routine. Procedure. "Are both parties present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ms. Harper answered. Mark's attorney, a thin man with restless hands, stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Reynolds glanced at the file, then at Tessa. A fractional pause. "Ma'am, please state your name for the record." "Tessa Monroe." "And your relation to Mr. Bennett?" Mark's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, Ms. Monroe is Mr. Bennett's partner." Partner. Such a clean word for such a messy truth. Judge Reynolds nodded, once expression unreadable. We proceeded. Asset disclosures, temporary support, residence occupancy. Mark spoke with rehearsed confidence. He painted a picture of a marriage that had deteriorated emotionally, of a wife who had become distant, of a man who had simply found happiness elsewhere. He was good. He'd practiced. And Tessa sat beside him, glowing softly with the visual evidence of their future. Until Ms. Harper stood. "Your Honor," she said, voice perfectly level, "we have a submission." She lifted a sealed envelope. White. Unremarkable. Devastating. Mark's posture shifted. Barely. But I saw it. Judge Reynolds extended his hand. Ms. Harper approached, heels measured against polished wood. This contains certified DNA test results relevant to statements previously made by Mr. Bennett. Silence tightened across the room. Mark's lawyer frowned. Your Honor, we were not informed. You are now Judge Reynolds replied calmly. He opened the envelope, removed the document, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. I didn't look at Mark. Not yet. I waited for the exact moment the color drained from his face. And when it came, it was exquisite. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in courtrooms. It's not the absence of sound. It's anticipation stretched so tight it feels like something might snap. Judge Reynolds's eyes moved steadily across the page, line by line. No theatrics, no raised brow, just the quiet authority of a man reading facts that would rearrange several lives. Mark stopped breathing. I didn't need to look to know. I could feel it, the shift in energy beside me, the sudden heaviness where arrogance had been sitting seconds earlier. Then came the smallest sound. Tessa. A soft, confused exhale. What? Mark's attorney leaned toward him, whispered urgently. Mark didn't respond. Judge Reynolds turned a page. The rustle was deafening. And that was when I looked. Mark's face had lost its color in uneven patches like blood retreating without coordination. His jaw-tightened eyes locked on the document as though he could will the words to change. He looked smaller. It should have satisfied me completely. But revenge, I was learning, is rarely a clean emotion. Because sitting next to him was a pregnant woman who suddenly looked terrified. Judge Reynolds finished reading. He set the papers down carefully. Mr. Bennett, he said evenly, do you wish to clarify prior statements made before this court? Mark's mouth opened, closed. His attorney stood instead. Your Honor, we request a brief recess. Judge Reynolds studied Mark for a long moment. Granted it with a nod. The gavel tapped once. And just like that, the room exhaled. Mark didn't move immediately. Tessa grabbed his arm. Mark, what is he talking about? He pulled away. Not violently, not dramatically, but with a reflexive irritation that told a deeper truth. This wasn't shock alone. This was exposure. Ms. Harper touched my elbow. Let's step out. The hallway felt colder than before. People passed carrying their own disasters, unaware they were walking through the aftermath of mine. I stood near a vending machine, humming tiredly in the corner. And memory began to bleed back in. Because betrayals don't begin with courtrooms. They begin with things so small you almost feel foolish noticing them. Mark's late nights had started 18 months earlier. At first it was plausible. He was expanding operations, meeting investors, networking. We were in our early 50s, careers stable, mortgage manageable, retirement accounts quietly growing in the background. The comfortable plateau people assume is safe. Then came the financial static. Charges that didn't make sense. A boutique hotel downtown. A restaurant we'd never visited. Rideshare receipts at strange hours. Business, he'd said smoothly. Always business. But numbers tell stories, emotions try to silence. I began downloading statements. Quietly. Not because I was suspicious. Because I was unsettled. There's a difference. Suspicion is loud, defensive, emotional. Unsettled is colder. More dangerous. Within weeks, patterns emerged. Transfers from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. Cash withdrawals just below reporting thresholds. Credit card balances increasing despite his claims of strong quarterly returns. I remember sitting at the kitchen counter at 2 a.m., laptop glowing, the house breathing softly around me. Every line item felt like a hairline fracture. Individually survivable. Collectively catastrophic. The confrontation when it came was almost boring. Are you having an affair? Mark didn't shout. Didn't deny. He sighed. Like I'd asked something inconvenient but predictable. Claire, this marriage hasn't been working for a long time. Deflection. Professional grade deflection. And then Tessa appeared. Not in confession. In carelessness. A message preview lighting his phone screen while he showered. Can't wait to see you tonight. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I took a photo. Evidence I would later learn is the most adult response to heartbreak. Back in the courthouse hallway, Mark and his attorney stood several yards away. Tessa's voice cut sharply through the air. You told me? Mark hissed something I couldn't hear. Ms. Harper handed me a bottle of water. Steady, she said. I nodded. Because the DNA results were only the first collapse. And Mark still had no idea how much of his carefully constructed life was about to come apart. People imagine revenge as something explosive. A scream, a confrontation, a glass shattering against a wall. Mine began with a spreadsheet. And the deliberate decision to say absolutely nothing. After the night I photographed Mark's phone, I didn't wake him. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't perform the wounded wife. I made coffee the next morning. Asked if he wanted eggs. Kissed his cheek before work. Not forgiveness. Strategy. Because by then instinct had given way to clarity. And clarity said something simple. If Mark knew I was aware, the evidence would evaporate. So I watched. Listened. Recorded. I opened a separate email account he didn't know existed. Downloaded years of financial statements. Backed up documents onto a password-protected drive I kept in my office desk, buried beneath folders labeled with the most boring titles imaginable. Quarterly tax estimates, insurance renewal, home maintenance. Nothing attracts less attention than administrative dullness. The spending escalated quickly once he believed he was undiscovered. Jewelry purchases, weekend trips, furniture deliveries I never saw enter our home. And then the transfer that changed everything. $75,000 from our joint investment account into Tessa Monroe's name. I remember staring at the screen, pulse slow and heavy as though my body had switched into some ancient survival mode. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was asset diversion. Legal theft wearing the costume of romance. That was the day I contacted Ms. Harper. Her office overlooked a parking structure and a row of tired palm trees. The decor was minimalist, neutral tones, framed degrees, a space designed to keep emotions from spreading. She read quietly while I spoke. No interruptions, no sympathetic noises. When I finished, she closed the folder. Do not confront him, she said. I wasn't planning to. Good, because right now he's careless. Confrontation makes men like your husband disciplined. Men like your husband. Not cruel, not immoral. Categorized. Clinical. He's moving marital assets, she continued. That changes the legal landscape significantly. The language of divorce is strangely antiseptic. Dissolution, distribution, disclosure. Words that sanitize devastation. We'll initiate discovery, she said. Forensic accounting, if necessary. And the affair. Ms. Harper's expression didn't shift. Emotionally relevant. Legally secondary unless it intersects with finances. It did. Profoundly. Over the following months, my life became a study in controlled duality. Outwardly, nothing changed. I attended dinners, answered emails, smiled at neighbors, discussed holiday plans. Inwardly, I documented everything. Statements, receipts, travel records, even the lies. Especially the lies. Because deception has patterns as reliable as bank transactions. Then came the pregnancy. Mark delivered the news with theatrical solemnity. I didn't plan for this. Of course he hadn't. Men like Mark rarely plan consequences. Only pleasures. I'm going to be a father, he said, watching my face carefully. Waiting. For collapse. For jealousy. For drama. Instead, I nodded once. Okay. Confusion flickered behind his eyes. That was the first time he sensed something he couldn't name. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that timelines matter. And biology obeys mathematics more faithfully than human narratives. Because certain dates didn't align. Certain absences overlapped too conveniently. And a casual remark from Tessa, overheard at a distance during a tense dinner encounter, lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I just hope everything works out the way it's supposed to. Not our baby. Not Mark's baby. Just everything. Uncertainty disguised as optimism. I mentioned it to Miss Harper. She didn't react immediately. Then she asked a single question. Would you like to verify paternity? There are moments when life offers you a door. Not dramatic. Not glowing. Just quietly present. Yes, I said. The legal process was precise, procedural, devastatingly patient. Motions filed, requests submitted, court-approved steps taken without spectacle. And through it all, I remained exactly what Mark believed I was. A woman too stunned to fight back. By the time we reached the courtroom, the truth was already sealed inside an envelope, waiting for the right voice to read it aloud. The months before trial did not feel dramatic. They felt administrative, which I learned is far more lethal. Because while Mark was busy building a new life vacations nursery furniture curated happiness, Ms. Harper was dismantling his financial illusions one subpoena at a time. Discovery is a polite word for excavation. Bank records surfaced first. Not the statements Mark had provided, those were selective, sanitized, strategically incomplete. The real ones came directly from institutions. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every quiet rerouting of marital money into places he assumed I would never see. Forensic accounting sounds cinematic. In reality, it looks like a middle-aged CPA with rimless glasses highlighting columns in absolute silence. Mr. Feldman spoke rarely. When he did, it was with the calm detachment of a man discussing structural damage. These transfers, he said, sliding a page toward Ms. Harper, indicate intentional concealment. Intentional. Not impulsive, not romantic. Deliberate. Mark hadn't just been cheating. He'd been repositioning assets in anticipation of divorce. And doing it badly. Because arrogance breeds sloppiness. Meanwhile, the DNA process moved forward with the same quiet inevitability. Court authorized. Chain of custody documented. No room for theatrics, accusations, or emotional reinterpretation. Just biology. Verified. I never saw the test performed. I didn't need to. Some forms of truth are most powerful when they remain unseen until the precise moment of revelation. Mark, unaware of the approaching collapse, grew increasingly confident. His filings became aggressive. He claimed financial strain, requested spousal support limitations, painted himself as a man burdened by a financially dependent spouse. Dependent. The word might have amused me if it hadn't been so grotesquely inaccurate. I had worked for 31 years, paid into retirement, maintained health insurance, managed the household when his entrepreneurial phases destabilized income. But lies, when repeated under oath, acquire a dangerous sheen of legitimacy, unless contradicted by documents, which we now possessed in abundance. There were moments I nearly broke silence. Moments that had nothing to do with money. Like the afternoon I saw them at a medical plaza. Mark holding Tessa's hand. Her laughter bright, careless. His face soft in a way it hadn't been with me for years. It is one thing to lose a marriage. Another to witness your replacement glowing with expectation. I sat in my car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling something colder than jealousy settle into place. Finality. Because by then grief had already done its worst. What remained was precision. Weeks later, Ms. Harper called. The results are in. No embellishment. No dramatic pause. Just 4 words that landed with terrifying weight. I drove to her office in silence. She handed me the report. I read it once. Then again. The language was clinical, unambiguous, irreversible. Probability of paternity. 0.00%. Mark Bennett was not the biological father. I expected triumph. Instead, I felt something stranger. Stillness. Because revenge at its most refined is not exhilaration. It is inevitability confirmed. Ms. Harper watched my face carefully. You understand what this means? Yes. It changes everything. It did. Legally. Strategically. Psychologically. Because Mark's entire posture, his courtroom arrogance, his public narrative, his moral positioning rested on one visual truth: the coming child. Now that truth belonged to us. Sealed. Certified. Waiting. In the final weeks before the hearing, Mark intensified his performance. He arrived to mediation with Tessa, spoke of new responsibilities, of future stability, of my supposed inability to move on. He mistook my composure for weakness, my silence for defeat. Men like Mark always do. The envelope remained locked inside Ms. Harper's briefcase. Until the morning he walked into court smiling like a man who believed humiliation was something he could outsource. He had no idea the real humiliation had already been printed, notarized, and scheduled for reading. Court resumed with the efficiency of machinery restarting. People filtered back into Department 42 carrying coffee tension and the faint smell of institutional air conditioning. Conversations hushed as Judge Reynolds re-entered, robe-settling expression restored to neutral authority. Mark looked different now. Not broken, but destabilized. His earlier radiance had vanished, replaced by a tight, brittle composure that strained visibly at the edges. Tessa sat beside him, spine-rigid, eyes fixed forward with the stunned stillness of someone recalculating reality in real time. Ms. Harper remained calm. She always did after impact. Your Honor. Mark's attorney began, rising too quickly. We request clarification regarding the DNA submission. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses. The court finds the report clear. A pause. Then, with surgical restraint. Mr. Bennett, you previously represented to this court that Miss Monroe's pregnancy constituted a material change in your financial obligations. Mark swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. Do you maintain that representation? Silence. Not defiance. Not strategy. Just the terrible paralysis of a narrative collapsing mid-sentence. His attorney intervened. Your Honor, we request time to review the documentation. Judge Reynolds's gaze hardened slightly. You were granted recess. The courtroom held its breath again. Because this was no longer about embarrassment. This was credibility. And credibility, once fractured under oath, rarely heals. Ms. Harper stood, unhurried. Your Honor, in light of the DNA findings, we would like to address related financial disclosures. There it was. The second detonation. Mark's lawyer stiffened. Objection, relevance. Ms. Harper's voice remained ice-smooth. Direct relevance, Your Honor. Mr. Bennett's filings repeatedly cited anticipated paternal responsibilities while simultaneously transferring substantial marital assets. Judge Reynolds nodded once. Proceed. Paper replaced oxygen. Exhibits submitted. Highlighted transfers projected. Line items illuminated under the unforgiving glow of courtroom screens. $75,000. Joint investment account. Recipient Tessa Monroe. Mark's face tightened further. His attorney shifted tactics. Your Honor, these transfers were gifts. Ms. Harper didn't blink. From marital funds. They were made during the marriage. Without spousal consent. Mark finally spoke. They were for our future. Even now. Even after biology had erased the foundation of that word. Judge Reynolds leaned back slightly. Mr. Bennett, marital assets are not discretionary personal funds. The reprimand landed softly, which made it devastating. Mr. Feldman's forensic summary followed. Clinical. Precise. Unemotional. Patterns indicate intentional asset diversion and incomplete disclosure. Intentional. Again that word. Stripped now of romance, exposed as calculation. Tessa turned toward Mark slowly. What transfers? He didn't look at her. I'll explain later. There is no lonelier phrase in a courtroom. Because everyone knows later is a fiction. Judge Reynolds continued. Mr. Bennett's failure to disclose assets accurately carries significant consequences. Mark's attorney attempted damage control. Your Honor, my client acted under emotional distress. Ms. Harper responded before the echo faded. Emotional distress does not produce structured financial concealment. A few restrained smiles flickered across the gallery. Not amusement. Recognition. Because by 55, most people have seen some version of this story. Judge Reynolds began outlining potential remedies. Sanctions. Fee reallocations. Asset adjustments. Mark's shoulders sagged incrementally with each word, the posture of a man discovering that confidence cannot cross-examine documentation. But it was the human moment that pierced deepest. Tessa's voice small and unsteady. "You told me you were struggling." Mark closed his eyes briefly. Not remorse. Containment. Judge Reynolds's tone sharpened. This court is not concerned with personal grievances, only legal obligations. Yet the damage was already personal. Irreversibly so. When proceedings paused, Mark turned toward me for the first time since morning. No triumph. No cruelty. Just naked disbelief. As if the universe had violated an agreement he didn't remember signing. I met his gaze. And held it. Not with anger, but with something colder. Completion. Because revenge is not the moment someone falls. It is the moment they realize the ground was gone long before they stepped forward. After credibility fractures, everything changes. Not loudly, but irreversibly. Judge Reynolds didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority, when grounded in evidence, has a way of lowering the temperature of a room while simultaneously increasing the pressure. "Mr. Bennett," he said, fingers resting lightly on the bench, "the court will now address financial remedies." Mark sat rigid, the earlier shock calcifying into something closer to dread. His attorney leaned in repeatedly, whispering fast, anxious fragments. Strategy had shifted from offense to containment. Too late. Ms. Harper remained standing. Composed. Ready. The projector hummed back to life. Exhibit after exhibit slid into view with devastating neutrality. Bank transfers, account openings, undisclosed liabilities. The quiet architecture of deception Mark had believed too complex to trace. It never is. "Your Honor," Ms. Harper began, "we request adjustment of asset distribution based on documented diversion of marital funds and material misrepresentation." The phrasing was deliberate, precise, lethal. Mark's lawyer rose again. "Your Honor, my client disputes the characterization of diversion." Ms. Harper didn't even look at him. "The bank records do not." Judge Reynolds nodded slightly. "Overruled. There are moments when a single word feels like a door slamming shut. This was one." Mr. Feldman resumed testimony. His tone remained maddeningly calm, the voice of a man explaining structural damage rather than personal ruin. Transfers totaling $112,000 were executed without disclosure or spousal authorization. The number landed heavily. Because Mark had spent months insisting financial strain. Months pleading reduced obligations. Months crafting the portrait of a man stretched thin by responsibility. Now the portrait was peeling under fluorescent light. Judge Reynolds turned to Mark. "Do you contest these figures?" Mark's voice came out rougher than before. "They weren't hidden." Ms. Harper responded instantly. "They were absent from disclosure." Mark hesitated. "They were temporary." Mr. Feldman's reply was clinical. Funds were not returned. The courtroom atmosphere shifted subtly, not toward drama, but toward something colder, inevitability acknowledged. Judge Reynolds began outlining consequences. Reallocation of assets. Potential sanctions. Attorneys' fees. Every sentence tightened the perimeter around Mark's options. Then came the detail that struck deepest. "Mr. Bennett," Judge Reynolds continued, "this court is particularly concerned with representations tied to anticipated paternal responsibilities." A measured pause. Responsibilities now contradicted by genetic findings. Mark's attorney attempted a final pivot. "Your Honor, emotional circumstances influenced my client's decisions." Judge Reynolds's gaze sharpened. Emotions do not alter disclosure requirements. The distinction was surgical. And absolute. Beside Mark, Tessa's composure finally broke. "You said you were broke." Her voice wasn't angry. It was wounded. which somehow cut sharper. Mark turned toward her, jaw tight. This isn't the place. She stared at him in disbelief. Apparently nowhere is. The bailiff shifted, alert. Judge Reynolds tapped his pen once. Order. But the human unraveling had already begun. Because deception rarely collapses along a single fault line. DNA had dismantled one illusion. Financial records dismantled the rest. By the time Judge Reynolds recessed proceedings for final submissions, Mark looked decades older than he had that morning. Shoulders bowed, confidence erased. The posture of a man discovering that charm has no jurisdiction over documented fact. In the hallway he approached me. Alone. No attorney. No performance. Claire. My name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Like something from a previous lifetime. I waited. He searched my face for something: anger, triumph, softness, anything he could use to stabilize himself. How long, he asked quietly. Long enough. You planned this? No, I said evenly. I prepared. There is a difference. He shook his head slowly. This is revenge. I met his eyes. This is consequence. For the first time, Mark had no response. Because somewhere beneath the collapse, truth had begun doing what truth eventually does. Settling. There is no applause after a courtroom collapse. No cinematic music. Just people walking out carrying folders, verdicts, and whatever remains of the stories they brought with them. Mark stood near the far end of the hallway, shoulders curved inward, speaking in low, urgent tones to his attorney. Tessa sat alone on a wooden bench, hands clasped over her stomach, eyes fixed on nothing. For the first time, they were not a unit. They were two individuals orbiting separate disasters. Ms. Harper closed her briefcase with quiet finality. We're in a strong position, she said. I nodded. Strength. Such a strange word for something that feels like surviving your own demolition. Outside, the afternoon sun hit with that dry California brightness that makes everything look deceptively ordinary. Cars moved. A siren wailed somewhere distant. A couple argued softly near the courthouse steps about parking validation. Life, stubborn, indifferent, continued. I drove home alone. Not to our house. To the townhouse I had rented 3 months earlier under the most neutral explanation imaginable: temporary space. Preparation has logistics. Change of address forms. Utility deposits. New insurance declarations. The architecture of leaving is profoundly unromantic. Inside, the rooms were still sparse. A couch. 2 lamps. A dining table that looked slightly too large for the space. The silence felt different here, not heavy like the courtroom, but clean. Unfurnished silence. Possibility-shaped silence. I placed my keys on the counter and stood there, waiting for the emotional surge people always describe. It didn't come, because grief had already spent itself months ago in spreadsheets, photocopies, and sleepless nights spent watching numbers confirm betrayal. What remained now was something steadier. Reorientation. My phone buzzed that evening. Mark. Of course. I let it ring. Then a text. We need to talk. Need. Another word that changes meaning after trust dies. I typed carefully. Through attorneys only. 3 dots appeared. Vanished. Appeared again. Claire, please. Please. Once intimate. Now procedural. I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty. Out of boundary. The following weeks unfolded with the strange, dislocated rhythm of legal aftermath. Final submissions. Negotiations sharpened by exposure. Numbers recalculated under judicial scrutiny. Mark's tone shifted dramatically. No longer aggressive. Now conciliatory, almost fragile. The man who had walked into court beaming was gone, replaced by someone grasping for reduced damage. Tessa contacted me once. Unexpectedly. Her voice carried the brittle exhaustion of someone who had aged rapidly inside a single month. I didn't know about the money. I believe you. A pause. I didn't know about the lies either. Truth, I had learned, has collateral damage. I'm not your enemy, I said quietly. Another silence. Then softer. I think we were both lied to. There was no satisfaction in that realization. Only clarity. Because revenge loses its intoxication when the battlefield reveals shared wounds. Judge Reynolds's final hearing approached. Ms. Harper prepared with the same composed precision. Remember, she said, closure is not emotional, it's structural. Structural. Assets divided. Accounts separated. Obligations assigned. The mathematics of ending. The night before judgment, I slept deeply for the first time in over a year. Not because I had won, because uncertainty was finally dying. Morning arrived cool and pale. I dressed without hesitation. And as I stood before the mirror, I realized something quiet but profound. Mark had not destroyed my life. He had revealed which parts of it were built on illusion. The difference matters. Because one is devastation. The other is liberation wearing the face of loss. Judgment Day did not feel triumphant. It felt exact. Judge Reynolds entered with the same measured composure he had carried throughout the proceedings. No hint of drama, no indulgence in spectacle. Just the quiet gravity of decisions that would reshape the legal, financial, and emotional architecture of two lives. Mark avoided my eyes. Not defiantly, but like a man who no longer trusted what he might see reflected there. Tessa was not present. Her absence said more than any testimony could. Having reviewed submissions and evidence, Judge Reynolds began voice steady. The court issues the following orders. Paper shifted. Pens hovered. Lives recalibrated in real time. Asset distribution adjusted to account for documented diversion of marital funds. Undisclosed transfers reclassified. Attorney's fees partially reassigned. Financial consequences mapped not as punishment but correction. Justice, I realized, is rarely loud. It is arithmetic applied without emotion. Mark's attorney nodded faintly at intervals, already translating the ruling into damage assessments. Mark sat motionless, hands clasped too tightly, jaw set in the brittle stillness of a man absorbing the final cost of his own decisions. Judge Reynolds continued. There will be no spousal support modification based on representations contradicted by genetic findings. A surgical sentence. Clean. Irreversible. Because the courtroom is one of the few places where truth once documented cannot be negotiated back into fiction. When the orders concluded, the gavel tapped softly. That is the ruling of the court. No flourish. No theatrical closure. Just finality. Outside the courtroom, Mark approached me again. This time slower. Careful. Like someone stepping across ground he no longer assumed was stable. Claire. I waited. Because patience had become second nature. I never thought. He stopped, searching for language that no longer obeyed him. I didn't think it would end like this. It didn't, I said quietly. He frowned slightly. It ended long ago. The truth landed between us without hostility. Without heat. Just fact. He exhaled shakily. I was unhappy. I know. I didn't mean to. Yes, I said gently, you did. Not accusation. Recognition. Because healing does not require softening reality. For a moment, Mark looked like the man I married decades earlier, stripped of performance ego narrative. Just a tired human being standing inside the ruins of choices he could no longer reframe. I'm sorry, he said. And for the first time, it sounded real. Not because of the words, because there was nothing left for him to gain. I studied his face, saw regret, saw loss, saw the quiet terror of a future no longer padded by illusion. I hope you learned something from this, I said. He nodded slowly. I already have. We stood there in silence, not as enemies, not as partners, but as two people who had once shared a life and now shared only its consequences. I did not feel victorious. I felt finished. Because revenge at its most evolved is not about destruction. It is about restoration. Of truth. Of balance. Of self-respect. As I walked down the courthouse steps, sunlight spilling across concrete, I understood something I wish I had known years earlier. You do not win by making someone suffer. You win by refusing to let their choices define the value of your life. Some endings are loud. Mine was quiet. And that made it stronger. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever chosen dignity over chaos, patience over impulse, I hope you carry this with you. Truth does not rush, but it never forgets. Subscribe for more stories about strength, consequence, and the quiet power of timing. Share your thoughts below. Your voice, your experience matters.